When did he become a fucking producer on the show?
I don't know, but depending on...
Well, I get that he tells me so much about it. I get the gist of it.
Yeah, but depending on who you
I'm
are...
Here's the thing. Money will always...
what you're putting down.
Money will always be topical, right? Because someone's always drowning.
We are in the basement / office of former guest. Now you get to see him on our lovely camera there. Chris, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
What's new with you?
Living the dream.
Oh, very good. Very good. And we're, as always, joined with Remy. I purposely have put my back to the camera so we can see his lovely angelic face.
Hello.
All right. So, Chris, what are we here to talk about this time? The last time we talked about finance, and you were very enlightening about credit. You were very enlightening.
It's kind of you.
You were very enlightening about the importance of debt. Debt is not a bad thing.
Right.
We talked about our mutual disdain for people younger than us.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So what are we here to...
Pull work ethic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
what are we here to talk about today?
Well, I think probably a continuance of the conversation we were having before about navigating some of the topics of that podcast, but more specific to current day, right? So
yeah, so we're in the fall of 2023. So, well, what's going on financially in the world right now?
Well, money's expensive, so rates have gone up, right? So we talked before about
how... That's a very nice, simple way to put it.
Yeah. So we talked before about how borrowing isn't necessarily bad unless someone's independently wealthy. You're always going to have to borrow money. But right now, it costs proportionally more than it did, like this time even a year ago, to do things like buy a house or to buy a car, to have credit card debt. So those factors in itself represent significant challenges to some people who might have been right on the edge between being able to afford a car or not, or if they could afford sort of like a limited before, and now they might have to get like an XLE, so like I think that it might be of some value to talk a little bit about how you can sort of level the playing field, because obviously most consumers are at a significant disadvantage when they go into a dealership or when they try to do something like that for the first time. So we could talk about that. Yeah.
So we're far removed from the cliff that some people thought Silicon Valley was going to lead to.
Right. Yeah. I think you're alluding to everybody thought we're going to go into a recession, and that's past now. We're not. Yeah. But there are still some things that come along with the inflation that we experience, which is still there. So,
Remy, you wanna chime in at this point?
I'm poor.
Well, besides the poor,
you could be poor and still have a good life if your cost of borrowing is low.
See, I'm good. I can leave now. That's all I needed to hear. No, I kind of had for these episodes particularly, and I said it the last time, I'm a little more backseat. There'll be points when I'm gonna represent really poor people, I think, in the discussions if those opportunities present themselves. But mostly for me, these episodes are a crash course. I find them incredibly interesting. So don't be turned off or think it's anything strange if I am a little quiet. I'm learning as much as they are in these processes because I don't know shit. So it's very intriguing stuff. But thank you for giving me an opportunity.
Yeah. No, you're very welcome. I just wasn't sure if that was a good time. Just where if you had any thoughts, because Chris has said and Chris, this is something Chris and I have talked about, that what people thought Silicon Valley was going to lead to was a snowball of fuckery, for lack of a good way of putting it. It was just going to be like dominoes falling, multiple dominoes falling, and like Chris said, it didn't happen that way, and there's reasons why. Chris has told me why.
Yeah.
Well, to put it in context of what happened, like, so when you say Silicon Valley, what you're referring to is a relatively small regional bank, right? So you have Bank of America, you have like JP Morgan Chase, those are huge banks, right? And then you have regional banks like Silicon Valley, Citizens, Santander, that don't have branches or a footprint throughout the entire United States. And what happened was that bank invested very heavily in one particular type of investment, and that was venture capital debt, and it blew up in their face. So So it was like you were saying, it was thought that it was possible that could erode confidence, consumer confidence, sufficiently enough where everybody could start drawing out all of their money, taking out all their money. It's called a run on the banks,
which is essentially what happened in 2008. What I mean by that is people got worried and people started taking their money out.
No.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying, though.
Nope. 2008 was way worse. It had to do with mortgage notes, like poor subprime mortgage notes being represented as like grade A. But this is actually what happened with the Great Depression, where basically people got scared, so they thought their money wasn't safe, so they took it out. And yeah, that's basically at a high level what happens. And it sounds probably like super simple, that if people could like all of us could just go to banks, take money out, and then cause a massive failure of our economy. We can do that. We don't want to do that, but that's exactly what could happen. And that's sort of what began to happen. But thankfully, between government intervention a little bit and other businesses stepping in, like the financial institution I work for was one of the major companies that stepped in and invested massive amounts of capital to save these banks. It worked out. People didn't take all their money out. We kind of moved on to the next news cycle, and it was okay. But to go full circle back to what we're talking about what's a challenge right now is that it's expensive, right? So even if the cost of a gallon of milk is back to normal, it's still expensive to buy a car. It's expensive to borrow money. And but there are some ways to still be, like, if you have to buy a car, or you really, really want to buy a car, or you have to buy a house, or really, really want to buy a house, there are still ways of doing it and still being able to afford it. And one of those ways is to shop around, right? So one of the worst things you could ever do, to be specific, one of the worst, like specific to buying a car, is finance it through the dealer. Worst things you could do, because there's no greater example of they saw you coming, right? Because if you go in and you say, I'm going to buy this car, and and I want to finance it, that you just basically held up a sign saying, I'm an idiot, right? Like I shouldn't, that's not very nice, but that's what they're thinking about you, right? So it might not sound me nice saying, but that's what they're thinking about you, because what you're telling them is that you're willing to pay for the convenience of financing it through them, and you're going to the greatest extent that they can possibly get away with it, let them pick what your rate's going to be. Because what the dealership's going to try to do is profit on, it's called the front end and the back end. They're going to try to profit on you as much as they possibly can with a car, and they're going to try to profit as much as they possibly can on the back end, which is the financing and the warranty and all that.
So how does your average layman prevent that when trying to buy a car?
Great question. It's easy, super simple. So you shop around for a car, right? So you might say, oh, I'm kind of thinking of getting a Ford F-150. Well, you don't typically just show up to a dealership and buy the first one that you see at the first dealership that you go to. You usually go online, you shop, right? Well, you should do the exact same thing for your loan. And it's really super simple. You just go online, you Google car loans. There's an infinite number of banks that, almost every bank on the planet finances auto loans, and some of them actually specialize in it. So you just shop rates. Now, a good rate is something that's earned. So you should be, or anyone should be, what's the word for it? Realistic about and educated on where you fall as far as your credit score is concerned, and what that then translates to as far as interest rate, which, as most people know, is the cost of borrowing, right? So that's what the bank makes on you. Someone with a mid to high 700, 800 credit score would qualify for a very, very low interest rate, up to, like, say, 0%. And then someone with a credit score that's like in the high 6s or less, that's when it starts to get a little bit more expensive. But the best place to start is to understand where, generally speaking, interest rates are. Like, I got a little bit of a shock the other day when I came to find out that, put it this way, last time when I financed my truck, Interest rates were around 3%. I think the interest rate on my truck loan was like 3.24%. It was almost the same as the mortgage that I had. And now I think they're like 7.
Oh well.
So they're really high. So actually, I think the national average car payment is like $774, which is really freaking expensive, right?
Dollars?
Dollars.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. Great. I know.
Oh,
That is insane.
nuts.
People are paying it though. But the idea is number one, know what is, like, in air quotes, a good interest rate right now. And now if you have good credit, you should get that good interest rate. And you're only going to get it if you make sure that you got to make sure that you do, right?
Because you're saying in the car dealer, they want to get you they want to gouge you as high as they can.
That's how they make a living.
And you going in and trusting them is the stupidest
possible thing you could do, right? So a dealership is there to beat you, right? It's someone, when someone wins, someone loses.
It's like Vegas.
Yeah,
Like the house wants to
there's
win.
no better example. That's a perfect example. It's like you're going against the house. When you go into a car dealership, you're going against the house. And so to get an auto loan from them is it's just crazy. It's quite literally crazy, because you will almost never, outside of being a super well-informed consumer with very, very good credit. Like, I'll use myself as an example. I'll be arrogant for a minute. If I walk into a car dealership, I'm going to know exactly what I qualify for. I'm going to know exactly what I'm entitled to from the way of my credit. So there's no way I would leave that dealership with a loan that doesn't suit my needs and my appetite, right? So, but most people who go there aren't as well informed as myself or a lot of other people or some other people. So they're gonna let the finance manager dictate to them, hey, I fought for you, and I was really aggressive, and I beat the banks up a little bit, and I was able to get them down to this.
Yeah,
right.
10%.
Yeah, they're gonna use words like that, and you're gonna be like, oh man, no, I really appreciate that.
But the reality is that they kind of have an a la carte of several banks that
that's exactly right
that they work with.
Yep, and
they already know the rates,
right? And the banks specialize in different types of credit and in different types of vehicles, and so you're at a huge disadvantage if you finance your car through a dealership unless you're super savvy and you've done your homework. But most of the time, it's just really not worth it, because it's going to take you way longer. It is so much simpler to finance a vehicle through a regular bank, like, I don't know, Harbor One. Does Harbor One even exist? I don't even know if they still exist. I think they do, yeah. Or whoever bought them. So like a local bank, you can do it online. Even you can get a pre-approval, and then you go to the dealership and you're like, okay, I'll pay this amount for that vehicle, and you should write it on a piece of paper and say, let me know when you'll sell it to me for that, and then just walk away. And they're gonna be like, no, wait,
because they don't want to lose the sale.
Yeah, and they're gonna say, oh, well, how are you gonna pay? Cash. Because as far as they're concerned, it is cash. They don't have to find it. You're gonna go, because you're gonna get what's called an RMV1, and if you buy that car, and then you're gonna give it to the bank, and then they're gonna write a check to the dealership. So as far as the dealership is concerned, it is cash. You are paying cash because you're financing it at a bank outside of there.
Is it fair to say you take out their middleman and you just put in your own middleman? As far as the bank
well, you
goes.
become your middleman. You're taking out because you have. As you say, use an example like Capital One. So you have Capital One, and then you have the finance manager of the dealership, and then you have you. So you have that finance manager doing his absolute best to, on the back end of this deal, make as much profit as he can, because that's actually where the finance department of a dealership makes their money, is in the financing, and then
the fine print.
Yeah, and the warranties and all of that stuff. So. Yeah, so for buying a car, there's ways of doing it. So you would not be best served, or you would be doing yourself a disservice if you walked into a dealership and then you let them tell you, oh yeah, I can get you 7%, and this is going to translate to this payment on this type of vehicle. And if it's too expensive for you, the biggest mistake that you can make is be like, oh, I guess I can't afford that car, or I'm going to quit.
So now, out of curiosity, apply that to housing.
Yeah. It's not, you don't have quite as much control or power or influence with buying a house as you do with a car.
So in other words, you can't go in there with that written down number like you do with the car. That won't work.
No, but you should shop around. You should. And the day and age we had to have 20% isn't necessarily. Well, let me put it to you this way, right? It's like everyone's talking about seven. Like I think the interest rate right now is somewhere around seven something. Ironically enough, for houses too, and they're talking about. I keep on hearing the word in news use sky high interest rates. Now, when our parents ish age bought a house, it was 13%. That was the average interest rate.
That's true. That's facts.
Yeah, and it's like so. What in God's green earth is sky high about 7%? Absolutely nothing. We've had a number of years where interest rates on mortgages were artificially low, is what the real issue was. They were artificially low, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that I won't get into. But
was that The Big Short? Have you ever seen that film when they talk about shorting the whole housing industry?
Yeah, that was more representing crap loans as being not crap.
Oh, okay.
Kind of. So what happened was kind of the 2008 thing is what happened was is that. So we all hear about like regulation, right? So that's basically the federal government saying, okay, banks, here's a list of things that you can't do. These are the no-nos. Kind of like if you're playing Operation, it's hitting the kidney, right? Yeah, so they're saying you can't do the right. So what happened was is that what the federal government did is they took all the out of mortgage lending, right? So they basically said, hey guys, you police yourself, right? You got this, right? Yeah. You got this. And other banks were like, trust you. Yeah, we trust you, right? Yeah. So what did they do? They literally bankrupted the U.S. economy because what they did is they gave mortgages to anybody with a pulse, but to make matters worse, so it was twofold. They gave mortgages to anybody with a pulse, and then they took those crap mortgages and they sprinkled them with a bunch of good mortgages. And then they went onto Wall Street and they said, here are some investment portfolios that have grade A notes in them. And because of the lack of regulation, they were allowed to do it. And so then you have the huge investment firms bought those portfolios. They were allowed to do it. And then all of a sudden, delinquency started to tick up. And they're like, and just as a point of reference, the most like for decades, mortgages were always considered to be a sure thing, right? Kind of like home values going up.
Are you talking like more stock market type of stuff?
From an investment perspective, like when people bought mortgage portfolios, they were no one would ever buy a mortgage portfolio concerned about it defaulting. No, because no one defaults on their mortgage.
Suddenly that was a problem?
It was worse than this. Is like not only did all of a sudden what was represented as grade A paper started defaulting, but then home values started to go down, right? Or they weren't going up. So then all of these people who got mortgages that only barely had a pulse, right, thought that they were going to be able to refinance. And they couldn't. So all of a sudden all these balloon payments started to kick in and be triggered. And then it was quite literally the perfect storm. Every conceivable bad thing that could have happened to cause everything to implode upon itself basically left all of these enormous financial institutions shit out of luck. What happened was there was nothing they could do because they had really invested heavily in what has always historically been a sure thing, and then no one was paying their mortgages. So the bottom fell out. Like we all know Lehman Brothers went out of business, right? Well, that was why. There's no more Lehman Brothers because of that. And
a lot of small and mid banks were absorbed.
Gone.
Or they
failed.
Themselves.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not smart enough to say it can never happen again, but it would be almost impossible for something like that to ever happen. I mean, you would literally have to peel back every possible conceivable financial regulation imaginable, and I don't think anyone would get away with that.
So is it fair to say that when things like this happen, what everybody does is put stopgaps in place?
They try. Well, they try to, but so that stopgap is a form of a law, right? Yeah. So or a regulation, and if someone comes along and is like, "Oh, we don't need that anymore," so there went that stopgap. You know what I mean? Like, there's a law called Dodd-Frank where they created a ton of regulations, right? And some of those have gone away. So they sunset, they expire, and they've gone away. And then so now the banks can get away with a little bit more. Believe it or not, and it's very frustrating. Is like you got to keep in mind is that people who do this are very bright. People who run these banks, who create these financial instruments, are always going to try to find a way to make money. And They create new inventive financial instruments or mortgages to accomplish the same thing of being able to keep up, keep the wheels moving and everything. Because if only the very, very well qualified out there are the ones getting mortgages, no one's making any money. You know what I mean? So they've got to, that's just the way, it works. So
I want to go back to how you compared what happened this year with smaller banks. Silicon Valley being the whipping boy, unfortunately, like a better way of putting it, being the only, were they the only bank or were there other
First
banks?
Republic did too.
Okay.
Yeah.
You said it was comparable to the Great Depression in the 1920s.
Well, it was a tiny example. I don't know if it's like anybody cares about like what happened is like, so what you have deposits, like the money that you put in the bank, because you and I talked about this, right? So like most people would think banks like to have money, right? So they like when people deposit their money in a bank. But if you think about it, what does a bank have to do with money that's deposited into it? It has to pay interest on it. So believe it or not, deposits to a bank is a liability. They don't really want to have. Well, I shouldn't say they don't want to have, but banks, if a bank is being managed responsibly, it doesn't necessarily want to have a crazy amount of money deposited into it, because it has to find ways of investing that money responsibly to earn money so that it can afford to pay out the interest on the money that's deposited. So when you put money into a savings account, you expect, I mean, it's a piddly rate, right? You get piddly money, but you get paid money on that. The bank has to make that money somehow to pay out on it. So what happened with Silicon Valley is that they convinced, and this is like high level, like kind of simplifying a little bit, but they convinced a whole bunch of venture capital firms out in Silicon Valley to deposit their money, all their capital. So the bank all of a sudden had a huge influx,
surplus,
a huge amount of money, right? So
which they had to pay interest on all of it.
Right. So they had to figure out, where are we going to invest this? And again, just simply put, they picked a very risky type of investment. Wasn't illegal, just risky, right? All banks invest in venture capital, like startups, basically is what they did. All banks do, but it's like a 1% of their portfolio. It's a small little smidgen amount, right? I think Silicon Valley's was like 15%. So they invested very heavily in this particular type of segment of the economy, and then things started going wrong. So then these investments really
dominoes.
So they weren't panning out well, and word got out. So when word got out, everybody went and said, "I'm taking my money out,"
which caused huge other problems.
Well, right. They had invested this money based on revenue or deposits that they had. And if they no longer have sufficient deposits to support their investments, then they implode. Yeah. So it's called the bank fails. So the bank failed the moment that it didn't have sufficient deposits to support. It's like the chicken and the egg. It's like you have to go.
It's a loop.
It is. So if all of a sudden the consumer goes in and they take their money out of that loop, that circuit, it fails. Right. Yeah. So that's what, when they say a bank has failed, that's what they're talking about, is that enough people went in and took out their deposits that were there, that were needed to back the investments that these banks made. Now they only made those investments because of the deposit. So it's like, it's a certain, and that's the banking system. That's how the banking system works, is like, you put money in, the bank takes your money, it invests it in something so that it can make money to pay a return on your deposits. And what the bank tries to do is make its profit on the margin, right? So they'll saying like living on the margin. It's like, that's what the bank does. So yeah, you get your slice, you get your little piddly 31 cents a month. I mean, it's ridiculously low. And then the bank gets the difference on between what it was making on that investment and what it needs to pay out on you. They'll pay to you. So, but again, when there's
a discrepancy, everything falls apart.
And then when the people that put that money in first, that triggered the bank to invest in all of this because it needed to, goes back and says, no, I changed my mind. And of course they're entitled, but it's not typical, right? If you have someone, or a whole bunch of people that puts $10 billion into a financial institution, you don't expect them the next week to go back and take it all out.
Yeah.
That's not normal. That's kind of like what happened. It's like they all the money went in, people got spooked, all the money came out, and the bank's like, oh crap. And now you guys might remember I think it was the CEO or the CFO got some really bad press because of the way that he made this public. He went on what's called an earnings call. Like you have to have usually periodic calls, and it's literally a call. And here's what's going on. Well, what he did is he went on this call
and
told them about all of the money that had been taken out. So usually what will happen is if they're smart, they'll spread it out a little bit, right? And this is not illegal. What I'm talking about doing is that they're not going to basically give all the bad news right at once because they don't want to spook the investors, right? So they'll say, okay, we have realized this amount of decrease in deposits as of this period of time, with this ending this period, resulting in the following ratios, right? And then the investors will be like, well, okay, let's see how this goes on the next call, right? So now they have their attention, but no one's freaking out. Well,
let's stick with the Vegas example. He just pushed all the chips in.
He pushed all the chips, and he's like, yeah, it's all gone, right? He's basically
which caused a mass panic.
That's all. Then all the investors are like, what, right? And then they all just took all their money, and that was 100% avoidable. Well, 96% avoidable. And so he was viewed as being just totally negligent in how he handled that, because there's the right way and there's the wrong way. So yeah, I mean, that's in a nutshell, that's kind of like what happened with that. But it was contained. The good news is that it was contained and it didn't get worse. And that's some good news. So it goes to show, like, because I know, like, it was on the news about how, and it was a good thing, you had elected representatives talking about how our financial system is strong. You know, the President Biden was saying that over and over again. He should. That's his job, because it is strong. And he should have reminded everybody of that so that he avoid a panic, right? And it worked. So you didn't have a massive run on all the banks. So that was good. So
we're strong enough to absorb or handle this.
Yeah.
Blip,
and that's what's in reality, that's what should happen. I mean, businesses go out of business every day, right? And banks are no different. Banks are absolutely no different. And the U.S. economy is and should remain strong enough to be able to have that happen, because it's healthy. It's like the natural cleansing of the financial industry. You know what I mean? Yeah. If you like Bed Bath & Beyond, they just went out of business.
Which time? Because they came back and then they
they're done. They're done. Christmas Tree Shop went out of business. I mean, in many cases that's inevitable, but it's also because of how they were run. It's a failure to change and evolve. You know, so it happens. But to kind of like to what we were talking about, which is like more practical to the average person, is that, you know, when things get tough, you know, when costs go up, particularly the cost of borrowing, you can't stop living. You know what I mean? That's the reason that I was thinking about worth talking about today, because people who are listening, there's people out there that need to buy cars. There's people out there that probably still want to buy a house. And even though they say like, oh, the American dream's dead, or it's like impossible to have, it really isn't. It's not dead, and it's not impossible to have. It is very expensive. So you kind of have to be practical and realistic about what you can afford. And
well, can I ask you something in that venue? Okay, so we have a world right now, and unfortunately I'm a part of this, but it's like everything in the last 2 years has exponentially gotten more expensive. Groceries, gas, whatever it is, it's all just compounded. And there are a lot of people right now, myself included, who can't find apartments. Like a 1-bedroom now is like $1,800. When you put that with the price of groceries and the price of everything, and the fact that people are still getting paid shit, how is this not a recession or an impending depression? Because I see people, and I know people who are like, fuck it, I just have to kill myself. There's nothing I can do.
Yeah. So it might not be a depression, but it is depressing. You know,
okay.
It is.
Yeah. Well said.
It's not fair. It's not definitely not fair.
Yeah.
And as we all know, because all of our parents told us, life isn't fair.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
True.
Outside of having some type of really profound connection or reason to live in New England, you're borderline crazy for being here, right? Because there is almost nowhere else in the United States, with limited exceptions, that's anywhere near as expensive to live here. People have the impression that, oh, it's the taxes that make Massachusetts expensive. It is not. I mean,
Price of things.
people, and I could actually intelligently and eloquently debate that fact with anybody who wants to try to make a case that the taxes in itself is what makes Massachusetts expensive. It is not.
Yeah.
Because let me give you a really quick, very simple example. Do you think for 1 second that it is cheaper to run the state of New Hampshire than it is to run the state of Massachusetts? Do you think that the roads cost less? Do you think that the infrastructure
No,
costs
everything's
less?
relative, right?
Well, it's what it is you pay one way or another. It's all in how the package is wrapped, right? So like in New Hampshire as an example, I can't remember entirely what they call it, but there's a particular type of tax associated with driving a vehicle that is extremely expensive in New Hampshire
Yeah.
that Massachusetts does
Doesn't
not
have.
have, right? So
So it's relative.
you
It
can
is.
you can call it a different thing,
Yeah.
but just think about it this way. The state of Massachusetts, or technically the Commonwealth of Massachusetts,
Commonwealth
It
means
is-
the same thing as state. It's fine.
yeah, it's similar, right? It doesn't cost more to run the Commonwealth of Massachusetts than it does the state of New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Because people point to states like New Hampshire that don't have sales tax, and they're like, oh, well, Massachusetts is crappier to live and more expensive to live because we have sales tax. Well, but sales tax, it's just one type of tax. And like as the example, New York, where New York has a menu of taxes, right? You have
Yeah.
local tax, county tax, state tax. You have all kinds of. So Massachusetts is expensive to live because it's highly desired. It's demand that drives cost. So people want to live, and I know we all take for granted. I know I do, right?
Yeah.
Until sometimes you travel somewhere else and you're like, oh wow, like this is the nicest the nicest hospital they have like in 500 miles,
Yeah.
right? And you look at it and you're like, oh wow, right? Like there's so many things. Like the beach. Guess what? The beach is a huge premium. Having the ocean right next to us, right, is a huge driver in value.
Yeah.
So Massachusetts is expensive to live because we have a lot of cool stuff that we just take for granted. That we're like, oh yeah, beach. So what?
Yeah, we
right?
have every kind of topography you could want.
We
We,
have
have
all- we-
mountains,
we
we,
have
have plains, we
mountains,
have valleys.
Right? We have the Berkshires,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You've got
Provincetown.
You've got all there's
Martha's
so much
Vineyard.
cool stuff,
Yeah.
and if you go to a lot of people, well, I'm going to move to like Arizona or something where it's cheap, right? And then number one, one of the biggest drivers, I know I'm going to say, one of the biggest drivers of cost of living is accessible healthcare. So think about it. We have the best hospitals in the world.
Mass Health too.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. Oh, do you think that might have something to do with why it's so expensive to live here? Best hospitals, not in the region, not in the country, not in the hemisphere, in the entire world.
Yeah. And
right.
Yeah. I mean,
So it's
that
like,
tells you.
so to your question, it's like, if outside of someone being very well financially positioned, it is always going to be a significant challenge to live here. It really is. And that's why I said, outside of that, right, it would not surprise me to know that a lot of people are looking to leave that aren't as well financially positioned as other people. You know what I mean? Because
that makes a lot of sense.
Because in a lot of cases, particularly with remote working, use myself as an example. If I didn't have kids, there's no way I would still live in New England. No way. 2 reasons. One, I'm not a huge fan of all the seasons and changing of the weather.
Yeah.
And number 2, I have a remote job. I could work anywhere in the world. Why would I want to live somewhere where it is so expensive to live when I can make the same amount of money and live in an area where, like, the same price that I spent for this house here, I could have an absolute palace.
Yeah.
Right? Like Texas is a perfect example. Do you know what $600,000 would get you in Texas?
A mansion.
A palace.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's like, that's the thing about New England it is not fair. To your point, your question, it's like it's
because I'm here, so this is what I'm seeing.
yeah.
And all right, no, that's why I wanted to ask you though.
And honestly, like the best advice I would give if someone was saying, "Hey, I'm having a really tough time here," and I would ask them, "Like, well, are you
what's keeping you here?
What's keeping you here? Like, do you have to stay here? Because depending on what type of skills someone has or what type of like work they're doing now, I mean, one of the first things I would say is if you looked into different types of remote professions, something, or are your skills transferable where you could live in an area where you could possibly make a pretty good living with a much lower cost of living, you know? Because the other thing too, you have to keep in mind is like, it's not just as easy as moving somewhere else. And like as Florida is an example. I think we had a friend, I don't remember, I thought we did, that moved to Florida or somewhere else. And then they realized how little they got paid. And they're like, oh Christ, like what did I do? Right? Because like if you're an electrician in Massachusetts versus like an electrician down in Florida, you're getting paid diddly squat in Florida for doing the exact same job. It's like, yeah, your housing cost is a lot.
So again, it is relative. It's like one hand washes the other.
But if you can have the best of both worlds, right? Like if you can work remotely or earn Massachusetts kind of money.
Where would you live?
Where would I live? I hear one of the Carolinas. I think it's North Carolina.
I would say either of the Carolinas. To be honest.
I hear like they have a good balance. I know a lot of people from Massachusetts that like go there. Like I hear about that a lot. A lot of people. I think it's in North Carolina or one of the two. But I mean, when they get hit with a hurricane, they get like decimated. But I mean, it's a good combination, sort of like good weather, bad weather, and the cost of living. You know, obviously is less, but. I don't know. I'd have to. It might. And you know, honestly, it might not even be in the United States.
There you go.
It might not, because particularly with just like the gun violence, like and knock on wood, it hasn't happened in longer time than I can remember about mass shootings. I mean, particularly with kids. Like I even told my wife, and I told Bob this before, is like we're one mass shooting away, and if there's one mass shooting in New England, I'm done. My house is up for sale the very next day. That's one of the things that I value about living in New England, where I can see, you know, a value in paying more for our cost of living, is like we have some of the most educated people in the United States that live in New England. And unfortunately, I know it might sound like I'm being a dickhead, but unfortunately enough, the more educated the population, the less stupid shit that you see people doing, right? And also, to be a little bit more sensitive to it, the less mental illness that you can often have. Whereas in New England, we have a lot more resources for people with mental illness so if God forbid they're having a tough time, not only do they have more resources, but they have a lot more educated people around them observing that and helping intervene, which you don't have so much when you're down in like Alabama, you know, something like that. So to go full circle, that there's a lot we pay for it. We pay a lot, but
there's value in it.
There's value in it. You know, at least I see some value in it.
Now, even though it is astronomically more expensive to live here, and here I mean specifically Massachusetts with this question, there have always been pockets where there is places where it's affordable for people.
But the crime rates.
It's that. But again, we're sticking with that. The trade-off.
The
trade-off is you're moving somewhere because it's more affordable. It's usually a lower economic status area, and you have to come along with stuff that comes along with that. And I bring that up because I saw in one of those areas that's near us, one of those cities, that rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is now over $2,000 a month. And I know you and I have talked about, if you're at a point where you're paying $2,000 a month for rent, why aren't you just getting a house? I know you and I have had that.
And then what about this? What about this? What about the fact that fucking $2,000 apartment is in New Bedford, which has some of the highest crime rates of all of Massachusetts?
And interesting, guys, we just went entirely 100% full circle, because this conversation is a perfect example of why having your financial house in order is so beneficial. Because if you find yourself in a situation where you're spending $2,000 a month on rent, then it would be a blessing for you to be able to then say, well, then if I'm going to spend $2,000 a month on something, I'm going to do it with something that I own. That's the cool thing about buying something. It's like over the long term, so you can get something nicer and nicer and nicer because you just let time go and value goes up.
Is it too strong of a take to say, when we use like New Bedford with that kind of price as an example, is that people are getting priced out?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And like we have a mutual friend that was spending, I think, $2,400 a month in rent.
Yeah, and not because of him, but because I just know, because I do through my work. I've heard people who live there. It's now over $3,000
Yeah.
a month.
And you have to think about that, right? Like you
40 grand a year almost.
I can't.
Wow.
I honestly can't relate to someone. Not understand. I cannot relate to someone who is okay with handing over $3,000 a month to, and in return for that,
Having nothing.
you simply have a place to sleep. I mean,
what it is.
I mean, yeah, you can maybe entertain at some level. You have no yard, right? You're building up no equity. You can maybe paint the walls pre-selected colors,
Yeah.
right? You live in what is the equivalent of an apartment building, right? So it's not like you're renting a house, which I could see some level of tangible benefits. When you could take that 3,000, because by the way, you're not getting one of those apartments with bad credit.
No, not at all.
Nope. So there's no one that's getting an apartment that can't get a house.
Yeah.
No, not happening, right? So it's but that's something I just can't relate to, like why someone would do that, make that decision. They make a conscious decision, like I'm gonna hand over. I mean, that's more than my mortgage. That is a huge sum of
There's
money.
this tweet this girl made. She was like, if any of y'all are paying less than $4,000 rent for an apartment, you're still a child. And somebody popped on the thread and said, if you're paying $4,000 rent for a house that you're not going to have, you're the fucking child.
Yeah, and an idiot.
But yeah, man, it's always really informative and interesting. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
It's been a
Chris.
pleasure.
All right. Until the
We'll
next
probably
time,
do it
everybody.
again in 3 months.
Yeah.
We'll just keep updating people.
We'll see what's going on in the world, and then we'll come back and ask Chris how we can save ourselves.
Sounds good.
Appreciate you, brother.
All right.
Yep.
Take care, everybody.